Dr. Goddard, please join us. We're looking forward to hearing from you as we go through the 5 steps of emotion management of angry teens. Wally?
Binoy, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to all who are a part of this. I really appreciate parents who want to learn more so they can be more effective in working with their children. And Binoy, are you wanting to check and be sure everyone's hearing okay, or should we just surge forward?
Let's just see. Everybody, yes, they can hear you, Dr. Goddard, and they'd just like you to be a little louder, please, and otherwise they're ready to go. And thank you, everyone, for commenting on there. Just a little louder, please.
Okay. And if anyone has trouble hearing, they could, I assume, make a typed comment to you, Binoy, and we'll make sure to make adjustments. Let me give you just a little bit of background to emotion coaching. This whole area was really developed most effectively by a man named John Gottman. John Gottman, in his research with children, learned that there are 4 ways of responding to children's strong feelings. And if you're a parent, you have seen children with strong feelings. And he said that among the common ones are first to dismiss the child's feelings. So let's set up an example. Imagine the child shouts out, "I hate my brother." Well, to dismiss that would be to say, "Oh, you don't hate your brother." A second way of responding would be disapprove. Disapproving is a little stronger than dismissing. Disapproving says, "You don't hate your brother, and I hate it when you say that." Then there's a third way of responding, which is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is where a parent really wants to be helpful but doesn't know what to do. It's just kind of lost. And so those are 3 ways that are common and not productive for responding to children's strong feelings. What we're, of course, going to focus on today is the productive, the positive way of dealing with children's strong feelings. And that's what John Gottman calls emotion coaching. So let's look at the steps. The first step, Benoit, is to be aware of the teen's emotions. Beware of the teen's emotions. Sometimes we may not be quite tuned in and we don't notice that our child feels hurt, humiliated, left out, discouraged. And so emotion coaching can't happen unless we're aware of the teen's emotions. There's a second step. That's to recognize that child's emotion as an opportunity for closeness and for teaching. And I want to say a little about that. Sometimes we think of the child's strong emotions as just a terrible inconvenience. Why don't you get over it? Why don't you be peaceful? Why do we have to deal with this? We think of it as just a distraction and a problem, and we want it to be gone or to never happen. But the wise counsel that I love from John Gottman is, hey, their strong emotions are a way of opening the doors for you to participate in their inner life, in their emotional life. And when they open that door, we ought not to be kicking it shut. So recognize the child's strong emotions as an opportunity for closeness and for teaching. The third step is to listen to the child with empathy and validate the teen's feelings. Perhaps you'll grant me a pet peeve. Often when we want to show understanding to children, what we do is we say, well, I know how you feel, or I understand. It's my opinion that there's hardly anything that shows understanding less effectively than saying that. Saying, I understand, when a child is feeling uniquely hurt or confused or frustrated, says, yeah, I'm on top of that. I know just how you feel. It's a dismissive way of responding to a child's emotions. Now, in saying that, I'm acknowledging also that we've all done that, and our automatic ways of responding to children's feelings are probably usually wrong. It's usually about restoring peace rather than helping a child to grow. So let's think about the fourth of the 5 steps in emotion coaching, and that's help the teen label the feeling. One of the great points that Haim Ginott, the great developmentalist and child psychologist made, is that as we talk with children about their feelings, we can use language that helps them to not only better understand the feelings, but to hang labels on these experiences they have that are initially very confusing to them. Like we might say, wow, I wonder if you feel humiliated, or maybe you feel very alone, or you feel very confused. Some of these are simple words, some may be more complex, but we can help the child to develop an emotional vocabulary by helping the child label the feeling they're experiencing. And then the fifth step, the fifth is to set limits on the teen's behavior while helping the child, helping the teen to solve the problem. So we do believe in limits on behavior. In fact, that really underscores one of the misunderstandings. Some people believe that by allowing a child to have these feelings and even taking such an interest in them, we're encouraging them to have hateful, resentful, negative feelings. It's simply not true. We are teaching them about their emotions and teaching them how to process them. So we set limits on their behavior and help them solve the problem. But when it comes to having feelings, we have total compassion. We're open to and welcoming of that whole range of emotions that are a part of the human experience. Doing this, of course, makes such a difference in children's emotional competence as they develop. And that's incidentally exactly what the research says, that when we use emotion coaching, children become more peaceful, more effective, more balanced. They become just all around better human beings. Now, as you look at these steps, why don't I leave these in front of you for a minute while I visit an example. Let me tell you a story about a boy comes home from school. He's junior high age or middle school age, those early teen years. He comes home and he's tense and he's upset and his fists are tight and you can just see that something is wrong. Now I'm guessing that the instinctive parental response to that is to say, what's wrong? What happened? And I think the almost universal response is going to be nothing. So knowing that it won't work, we still tend to ask the unproductive question, what's wrong with you, or what's bothering you? The more emotionally astute thing is starting with, one, being aware of the child's emotions, recognizing that there's an opportunity. We then communicate that we have seen the feeling and are trying to understand it. We establish our sensitivity through the way we respond by saying something like, wow, looks like you had a bad day. Or looks like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, son. Those very simple statements say, wow, I'm trying to read the message you're sending me with your body. I'm looking at you, I'm looking at your posture, I'm looking at your attitude and trying to understand it, and I'm going to try to reflect it back to you in the simplest way I know how, in the fewest words possible. Because one of the temptations is to say way too much. So let's imagine we've said, oh, son, looks like you've had a bad day. And then we stop. At this point, the child has a choice to make. In this case, the child said, you know what, we were riding home from school on the bus today, and everybody's acting crazy and running around and shooting spit wads and doing crazy stuff. And the bus driver stopped the bus, and he came back, and he grabbed me and stood me up and started yelling at me and blamed it all on me. Maybe this sounds remotely familiar. You may not have had a bus episode in your dealings with your child, but there's been something where the child reported having been dealt a dirty deal by someone. The instinctive parental response is to react based on experience with the child. If we tend to be really irritated with that kid, if we think that kid's kind of a troublemaker, if we're having a bad day, then we tend to say, you know, I don't know how that bus driver puts up with you. You shouldn't be allowed to ride that bus. You don't deserve it. Wow. I hope you're sensitive enough to know how that has to hurt a child, even as he may not admit it. Still, how painful to be told that somehow you aren't really fit for society. Now, there's another response that's not uncommon among parents. Sometimes we look at our dear child, the child we want to protect and help, and whom we would like to spare pain if we can, and we say, son, how about if you and I go down and find that bus driver and we rough him up a little? Now, okay, that's kind of extreme, but inside of us there tend to be these impulses. Nobody's treating my kid that way, and so that's the other response. Intriguingly, those two seemingly different responses have one thing in common. They assume that we know everything and can impose our omniscience on our child and the rest of the world. And they fail to help the child process the feeling they're experiencing. Instead, what I want to recommend is that number three is listen with empathy and validate the teen's feelings, or more broadly, the child's feelings. Listen with empathy. So if our son has said, everybody was acting crazy, they were being stupid, and the bus driver stopped the bus and came back and blamed it all on me. Oh, wow. I sure wish we were face to face, because I'm guessing a lot of you would recognize that there are a whole bunch of interesting feelings that are churning within the child. And our job is to listen with empathy and validate the teen's feelings. So maybe I would say simply, wow, son, that doesn't seem fair. I've listened with empathy, and I have said, you know, that feeling you have, I think I can understand that you might feel indignant and hurt and frustrated. And I want to show that by continuing to tune in to what's happening in your soul. So maybe we even say, oh, son, what a painful experience. But now look at step number 4. We help the teen label a feeling. Maybe when we've shown that little bit of compassion, the child says, yeah, I mean, everybody else was acting crazy. Why did he blame me? Oh, again. What an opportunity to show compassion and to help the child develop an emotional vocabulary. May we say, oh, son, it sounds like you felt humiliated. Isn't that a rich word? Do we remember being young and sometimes being mistreated or misjudged and feeling humiliated? Especially when called names in front of our peers. What an awful experience. Now with that little bit of encouragement, just those few words, son, I wonder if you felt humiliated. Yeah, I mean, why did he blame me? It's just not right. And again, in the simplest possible way, we show that we're tuned in, we do care, and we'd like to try to understand the feeling. And maybe our statements are as simple as, it doesn't seem right, or, oh man, you feel really cheated, don't you? You feel like an injustice was done. In simple ways, we show that we care about the child and his feelings. Let me make another brief aside. Sometimes we think that says we're endorsing the child's behavior. We're giving them carte blanche to be a terrorist on the bus, or a troublemaker at school, or a bully in the playground. That's not what we're doing. Yet ahead comes setting limits on the child's behavior and solving the problem. But when we're labeling the feeling, what we're doing is tuning into a heart, a hurting heart. And another of the great ideas from Wally Goddard is that when a child is showing strong emotions, this is not a time for advice or problem solving. This is a time for emotional first aid. Emotional first aid. This is a time to deal with the healing. So I don't say, oh, you were mistreated, son, and we're going to go hold that school district accountable. Now, that would be judgmental. But if I say, it doesn't seem fair, or, oh, you feel so hurt, don't you? I am showing compassion without judging. I have not weighed in for or against the son or for or against the bus driver. I am merely acting just as first responders do at the scene of an injury, someone in an auto accident. Any paramedic who says, boy, it looks like you're a bad driver, is not being very helpful. The first responders have the job of attending to the immediate injuries and seeing to the survival and well-being of the injured one. Now, we get to the step that we often jump to far too quickly, which is setting limits on the teen's behavior while helping solve the problem. Let me say we don't go to step number 5 until the child is feeling more peaceful. So imagine that we have continued to tune into the child's feelings. We have continued to show support. At some point, our son says, oh, and they just kind of heave a sigh and sag, showing that, yeah, they kind of got it out now. And at that point, let me suggest something that's probably surprising, but I think is wonderfully effective in parenting. Let's imagine we say to our son, son, you've had a horrible experience today, my goodness. No wonder you feel bad. I wonder, what do you think you could do to avoid having this kind of problem again? Notice what I've done. I have allowed my son to speak as the expert he is. He's the expert on what happened. He knows that maybe, while there were lots of other kids acting up, that they happened to watch the bus driver's rearview mirror and they gauge their actions according to his vigilance. Or there are other variables at play. He knows that he shoots spitwads and hits the bus driver while other kids shoot at each other. He knows things we don't know and never will know. So what if we turn to the child and say, what do you need to do to be sure that never happens again? He may say, you know, I sit next to Johnny, and Johnny always incites trouble, and I probably need to not sit next to him. Or maybe he'll say, I need to watch the bus driver's rearview mirror. Or maybe he'll say, you know, I just have this love of tormenting the bus driver. I probably should take my bike to school. The child has answers that we would never think of and that are almost magical because they're tuned into a reality of which he's aware and we are not. So I hope those 5 steps are kind of clear. Those are the 5 steps of emotion coaching, and they have a couple of particular outcomes that are especially important. One of them is they help the child become more aware of their emotions and more aware of how to deal with them, what they are, what they mean, and how to process them. Because instead of denying them or dismissing and disapproving of them, we have granted them that emotions are a part of the human experience, and we learn how to manage them. And then at the same time, we have taught a child how to take responsibility. And all that's done without a hint of blame. Now, if your child is the child who says it's all that dirty bus driver's fault, I think if the child were even remotely peaceful, I'd say, son, I don't doubt that the bus driver made some contribution to the problem, but my question for you is what you can do to prevent problems in the future. I'll bet you're a creative enough kid that you'll think of something that you can do. So having said all that, let's look at a couple other incidents to which this framework might be applied. But no, let's look at the story of Jacob. Now this is a story when we here in the University of Arkansas train child care providers, we have them think about little children and the problems they commonly face. And some of you may have children at different ages, both younger and maybe teenage children. So let's think about Jacob, who's playing with his friends. Another child bumps into him. Jacob is irritated by that boy, and he was instantly angry. He pulls back fist, and he's ready to hit that kid. He's ready to deck him, flatten him. Okay, Jacob. Jacob is hurt and upset. First step, be aware of the child's emotions. Now, if I have a history with Jacob, either as a teacher or as a parent, then I may know what this means for Jacob. Like maybe I know that Jacob feels like he gets jostled a lot by other kids because he's smaller than others. Now notice, that kind of interpretation requires that we be compassionate. The alternative is to be judgmental or dismissive. If I were to say, well, Jacob's just a hothead, he always has been a hothead, that's not a very sympathetic attribution to Jacob. In contrast, if I say, you know, Jacob sometimes feels picked on, that's the broader awareness of Jacob's emotions, isn't it? To know that he maybe feels left out or he feels picked on. And knowing Jacob and hopefully loving him, especially in the parental role, being deeply dedicated to that kid and his well-being, we can understand why he would be hurt and upset. So the second step in this emotion coaching, recognize that that his emotion is an opportunity for closeness and teaching. Boy, it's that attitudinal shift in our hearts that instead of seeing this as an inconvenience, instead of just wanting it to be done with, instead of not wanting to be bothered, we say, hey, the door was opened, a window was opened for us so that we have the opportunity of entering this child's emotional life. And then listen with empathy and validate the child's feeling. You know, Jacob, you hate being pushed, don't you? You're just sick of that. You sometimes feel like everybody's pushing you around. And boy, I can see why you'd be upset. So you can see that third step and how that plays out. We help the child label the feeling. It might be as simple as saying, oh, you're feeling pretty angry. Or maybe, I wonder if you're feeling indignant that you get picked on so much. Or right now you feel like hitting someone. And again, let me say it should be clear from our previous messages that we don't allow hitting. Hitting is not okay. But here's the key question. Have we all felt like hitting at one time or another? The feeling is understandable. The feeling is truly normal. So we help the child label the feeling. And then, and I want to stress this again, as soon as Jacob is feeling more peaceful, as soon as he's settled down, as soon as he has felt the healing salve of compassion and understanding enough that he's seeming more relaxed, more peaceful, and more ready to do some problem solving, then, and only then, can we move on to the problem solving. We might say, you know, Jacob, hitting people wouldn't do us any good, would it? I can understand why you're upset. What do you think we can do, or how can we understand what happened there? Do you think that kid was just being careless? Do you think that maybe he slipped, or do you think maybe he just didn't notice it because he was so focused on where he was going? Now, there's a little trick in some of what I'm doing there. It's offering some more neutral attributions. That is, instead of Jacob seeing this as a deliberate attack on him, I'm inviting him to see other interpretations, that maybe this is just an accident. Maybe it's maybe other people have stuff happening in their lives besides just simply tormenting him. I stress that because one of the things we know from research is that children who tend to be more angry tend to feel picked on, and that reality in their minds becomes a reality in their lives as they start interpreting what are sometimes actually neutral experiences as very hostile ones. That just a side note, the same thing happens in couple relationships. In marriage, for example, we sometimes get what's called negative sentiment override, where we get so upset with our spouse that even when they're making positive or neutral gestures, we see them in very negative ways. So, you know, I wish we were all face-to-face where we could easily process questions, but hopefully you have some, and you'll be entering them as the time comes. Let's look at the next situation. Situation number 2. Let's try to picture Ashley, a typical teen, you know, a good kid, a normal teenager. Let's picture Ashley. She's playing on her phone, you know, doing various games and apps on her phone, and she's texting maybe to her friends. And you're feeling maybe just a little bit irritated, and you ask, Ashley, have you done your chores? And she scowls, shoots you one of those terrible looks that you have come to recognize, and she snaps back with a rude answer. And then, in like manner, we may want to slap Ashley for just being so rude. I mean, how can she act that way to her mom or her dad? So I'll bet that situation doesn't sound too contrived, but sounds like something you might have experienced in the course of being a parent. So let's again apply those same 5 steps to the task at hand. 1, be aware of the child's emotions. Hey, if Ashley's your daughter and she's a teenager, you ought to know some things about her. Like maybe when you asked her about the chores, it was what was on your mind, but you didn't appropriately gently enter her life. Instead, you kind of busted down the door of her attention and shouted out, have you done your chores? Now, all of that, of course, seems fair enough to ask the child about their chores. But the point is, if we're truly aware, then before we even say a word to this very occupied, very intense, and very focused Ashley, we try to notice the child's emotions. And if we have failed to do that, then we, oh yeah, okay, I just knocked down the door. And maybe we recognize she resents being interrupted. Now, we all have a child who bothers us in a very special and predictable way. And the truth is probably that every child bothers us in some special way, but some of them step on that special nerve that gets to us more readily. And usually if we're introspective, wise, reflective, we recognize that something that we do automatically interferes with the way they are or who they are. And we recognize that in order to be an effective parent for that child, we may have to make some changes. We may have to adapt. We may have to, heaven forbid, grow. I like to say that our irritation is an invitation. Our irritation with a child is an invitation to think differently, see differently, even act differently. So anyway, being aware of the child's emotions. If we know Ashley and we remember our history, and instead of being inclined to blame our friction on Ashley, if we instead say, oh, you know, she hates being interrupted. And I just interrupted and did it kind of roughly. Or maybe the other issue is, another likely candidate is chores. Chores. We have some kind of history around chores. And I want to be really clear. I believe in chores. Our kids did chores, as they will attest. But the way we talk about chores, the way we schedule them and hold kids accountable, by doing that in ways that are sensitive to the child, we are more likely to create not only cooperation, but children who are themselves more sensitive people. So anyway, you get the idea that we can be aware of the child's emotions, and I'm, as you can tell, broadening that to say be aware of the child's history. and our history with that child. Second, recognize emotion as an opportunity for closeness and teaching. We know we stepped on a nerve there, and we can say, oh, I can be defensive. I can indeed act on my impulse and slap her, or slap her with a punishment. Or I can say, oh, I did that badly, and I can use this as an opportunity to talk about how we work together, which might include, incidentally, our own invitation to the child saying, how could I initiate these kind of discussions in ways that are more sensitive to you, Ashley? I know when you get involved with texting or gaming or whatever, that may be a bad time. Tell me when I do need to get to you and I do need to deliver a message. What's the best way for me to do that? So anyway, we can, instead of seeing this as, okay, here's World War III and I don't intend to lose, we can say, here's an opportunity to get close to Ashley. Here's an opportunity to create some new agreements, some new understandings. And we can listen with empathy and validate the child's feelings. So, she said her smart aleck thing and spoke volumes to us with her scowl. And maybe we say, oh, you don't like being interrupted when you're in the middle of something, do you? Or, that was really inconvenient, wasn't it? I mean, we try to listen with empathy. Now, we're not saying that her foul mood and her scowl and her rude answer are okay. We're not saying that. We're only saying, in order to get to a solution, in order for us to find a way to get through this difference, I'm going to be the diplomat, the wise one, the adult in the room who will try to understand what you're experiencing. Because until one of us is ready to be a grown-up, we probably aren't going to find a solution. So we help the child label the feeling. You're feeling pretty irritated, aren't you? Or you just resent those chores. You're sick and tired of it. I mean, by making simple statements or asking simple questions, we're really inviting the child to teach us, to tell us more, to help us to understand what their needs are so that we can be a little more sensitive to the way the child wants us to work with him or her, in this case, her. So again, I'd stress that short statements or short questions. Oh, you're feeling irritated, huh? Or, wow, I interrupted at a bad time, didn't I? Or sometimes you find it really annoying that those chores intrude on things that feel important to you. None of this should be done in the spirit of sarcasm or minimizing. If we do, and we can, there's nothing that prevents that. If we do, we can guarantee that we'll get a similar response. In fact, when let me cite another body of research that says when we use heavy-handed techniques, we get children who use what we call reactance. And reactance takes two general forms, a more passive one, where children say, okay, run my life. Okay, you tell me what to do. I'll just do what you say, which probably isn't a very mature, well, it's not. It is not a mature outcome for child development. The other form of reactance is when they get rebellious and say, you make me. Let's see you make me do it. And neither of those is a very good posture for teaching character or winning cooperation. So as the emotional pace setters and leaders in our homes, we help the child label the feeling. Let's move to that fifth step. We set some limits on the child's behavior while helping the child solve the problem. Texting is important to you, but chores are important to me. Will you tell me how you'd like me to bring up chores? Or what kind of accountability system can we set up so that I don't have to pester you? You don't like to be pestered. You don't like to be interrupted. Tell me what kind of accountability system we can set up. And just a side note, we can be absolutely strong, completely determined in setting some strong limits. Like, for instance, we may say, I think a fair rule is that you not eat dinner until those chores are done, or you not be allowed to go out for the evening until the chores are done, or whatever it is. Each family has their own rhythms and their own rules, and each family has to decide what it is that's required and what the contingency is. You're not allowed to do this until that is complete. Now the child may protest, that's not fair, and a parent can say, I am delighted to find a solution that you and I both feel good about. If you've got a better idea, I really, really want to hear it. I welcome your thoughts. I think a wise parent is strong enough to say, unless we can find a better way, we're just going to have to do it the best way I know how as the parent. And that is heavy-handed if indeed the parent is not open to the child finding new possibilities. Maybe a child says, hey, the particular chore I've been assigned is the one I hate most of all. I would take 3 different chores if I didn't have to do that one. So we negotiate those expectations. But when a child is, shall we say, non-cooperative, is not willing to negotiate, it's okay for parents to say, hey, here's the boundary. I'll expect you to do this and do it this way, unless you and I can figure out a way that we both feel good about. So there's another scenario. I guess we've given 3. The story told by Wally Goddard about a boy coming home after a bad experience on the bus, and then we've talked about a boy on the playground. We've talked about Ashley. I think with those as context for explaining that 5 steps to emotion coaching, I'll bet we're ready for questions and answers. And I think Binoy is going to be the spokesperson for those questions. Binoy?
Thank you so much, Dr. Goddard. That was great. I'm taking notes. I've got my 17-year-old to be who's giving me enough that I'm taking notes on here. And there have been quite a few questions. So
you can apply this today, huh? You've
got
a laboratory going, huh?
My home would be a perfect lab for your help. And again, for everybody on the webinar, thank you. On the screen here, there are 2 URLs that can point you towards more materials that Dr. Goddard is associated with and can help you with, if that would help. But there have been quite a few questions. And please, for the remaining amount of time till the top of the hour, let's see if you guys have any questions. Please type them into the question portion, and time permitting, let's see if we can have Dr. Goddard help us with these questions. Let me go to a question that came in.
Could I just say something about those 2 websites?
Yes, please.
The first one, AR Family, stands for Arkansas Families. I work for the University of Arkansas developing family programs. Virtually all of our content is available to you free at that website. You can go there any time of any day or night and find programs on couple relationships, personal well-being, and on parenting. And some of our programs are also in print, and they can be purchased in the hard copy, but all of the content is available to you free online. The second URL is a website I created related to the book, the classic parenting book that discusses this emotion coaching in practical terms. It's Between Parent and Child, written by Wally Goddard, and a book that I helped revise a few years ago. It is, I think, the classic parenting book, and the authoritative guide to self-help resources recognizes it as perhaps the best parenting book ever written, and that credit, of course, belongs to Dr. Wally Goddard. So the URL there, Between Parent and Child, is also the title of the book. On that website, I've posted information and some videos, and also some information from Between Parent and Teenager, another book that Wally Goddard wrote. So all that content is also available to you free. The book itself, of course, costs and can be purchased from any bookseller. So with that said, Binoy, shall we turn to a question?
Absolutely. And I'm going to start off with some very common questions that come about. Why is my teenage daughter always mad at me, even though I do everything I can to make her feel happy?
Oh boy, that's a tough one, isn't it? Why is the child always mad? And the answer to that question, the honest answer to any parenting question is it depends. It depends on the teen and where they are and what they're experiencing. But let's try to give a more complete and helpful answer than that rather broad one. Often teenagers are feeling a great desire to start being adults. Their whole developmental process is focused on being adults. Our entire history with them is of them as children. There is an inherent conflict in adolescence around that issue of their separating from us, they're developing their independent identity. So that chafing often generates a fair amount of anger in the teen and frustration in the parents. And I think the person asks why, but the practical response includes what you can do, which is, I think, to use the very thing we've talked about. And you don't want to torment the child with, why do you seem so irritable today? That's a very unhelpful response, but to say, you know, some of this doesn't seem fair to you, does it? It just seems unreasonable. Tell me what you think would be a reasonable way. And invite them to propose solutions. Invite them to invest some of that energy, some of that maturity into to coming up with better ideas for managing the family system. But it's fair to say that some anger, frustration, and chafing is absolutely a normal process as a child is pushing towards greater autonomy and independence. And parents tend to want to hold back on that. My recommendation in general is that we give children progressively more autonomy as they show that they're ready to handle it. It does not mean giving them full control of their lives in one fell swoop. It rather means step by step, line upon line, allowing them more responsibility. And as they progress, holding them accountable. But using the very thing we've talked about is not a bad place to start. You know, you sure are upset. You wish some of these rules weren't there. Or sometimes you wish you had a little more privacy, or maybe even your own place. I mean, some of that is an attempt to help the child verbalize their fairly generalized feeling of frustration. So that's probably a good starting place. Binoy, do we have another question?
Do you? We have close to 100 questions. We're going to have to.
Wow.
We're going to have to selectively pick the ones, I'm afraid, everybody on the webinar, to those that would help everybody kind of get it. One very appropriate question, going back to your Ashley scenario, is this question. I appreciate knowing how I, as a parent, can more sensitively respond to a child like Ashley, but isn't it important for Ashley to learn a better way to respond when interrupted as well?
That's a great question. It is a terrific question, but the problem is who's going to learn from whose example? Absolutely, Ashley should and does need to learn to be more sensitive and more appropriate in her responding. And the best way for her to learn that is for us to indeed model it. There are times when we can say, and it's fair to say, honey, I'm trying really hard here, and I'd appreciate it if you and I can work together. I'm feeling a lot of hostility, and I would like you and me to find a way to deal with this. And then if that doesn't generate a little bit more openness, then you might say, I'll tell you what, let's take a time out and come back to this. And by time out, I don't mean secluding either person in a room by force. I mean, let's just take a break from this conversation and return to it when our heart rates have returned to a normal level. So yeah, absolutely. She should learn to act differently. The parent should set an example, but a parent also has the right to call a child on it sometimes and say, hey, you know, honey, I'm trying really hard here, and I need you to work with me. And I think that's a fair way to respond to what may be the hostility that hasn't been outgrown yet.
Thank you. And again, there are great principles you're sharing. It is an emotional topic for us parents. I can see it right now. One of the questions that was previously submitted upon registration is appropriate for everybody. And so the question that you answered is to take time out, but here's a question that came in previously. How to discipline teens in the home when they disregard parental authority in the home? How to discipline teens in the home when they disregard parental authority in the home. We have lots of questions from those who have fostered children to those who've taken children that were abused in the past. It just comes back to how do you discipline, how do you respond in the home? That's why I picked that one, Doctor.
Yeah. Boy, that's the wisdom of Solomon kind of question, Binoy, and I appreciate the person who wrote that. As you know from our bio, the bio that describes the experience Nancy and I have had, we not only have 3 children of our own, but we also had about 20 foster children. And that question can apply equally well to either. However, with our own children, we have a history that should help us to understand what kind and amount of control works best and when and how to apply brakes to their lives. You know, we may know that a child doesn't respond well to the pecking at them and reminding and bothering them, but they do respond well to humor. And so we use what works with that child. I also believe our experience with our foster children is you have to start where they are and try to move them towards a slightly better place. And that means that the rules were different for our foster children than for our own children sometimes because they were in very, very different places. And truth to tell, we stopped having foster children in our home as our own children approached their teen years in order to prevent some of the conflicts that might arise out of those different rules. So we started by setting some expectations. Now, if a parent has never set a limit, if a parent has never said, that's just out of bounds, I can't allow that. If a parent has not fairly consistently been willing to be a bad guy who said, no, I don't feel good about that, then they're going to have a hard time starting to do very much of that all at once when a child is a teenager. I recommend starting where they are and moving steps in the right direction. There hopefully are some things, some resources that parents still control, like the use of the car, or hopefully parents have some control over the child's ability to go out and do things. And so start where you are and work towards a more balanced and responsible way of the child being accountable.
Thank you. I am looking at the clock. It's almost getting to the top of the hour. Let's try to squeeze in just a few more because there are so many questions. And what I'm looking, as I'm looking at the questions, is looking for these themes where I can pick out one that will take into account 3, 4, 5 other questions of the same kind. There is a lot, there is a trend here on the questions, Doc, on when you do everything you can, including homeschooling, to kind of keep the kids taught well, but it's almost like homeschooling and dealing with issues because they're at home, it almost seems to exacerbate everything, where we've got a 14-year-old who doesn't want to go to church, is homeschooled, to they won't even get in the car. There's is there anything you can help with as far as homeschooling and issues with teens? Is there such a connection of just being too close, maybe?
I think one of the problems is that when parents assume all the roles in a child's life, then things are a little bit more complicated because there aren't other people. Like, for instance, almost all of us have had someone outside of home who quite effectively set boundaries, like a coach who said, you want me to knock you down or you want to do what you're supposed to do? And that helped us say, you know, I am not the king of the universe. So it does get more complicated to homeschool because then parents are not only parents but also the educators. That doesn't mean it's bad. It means that you should only do it if you are able to manage both those roles pretty effectively. And in some cases that's not the reality. Sometimes these skirmishes happen because we show our irritation, they show their irritation, and the battle is on. And what I'm saying in part is that the best way to prevent that kind of problem is to first get our own minds and hearts right, be pretty clear about where the boundary is, and then start with what's a realistic starting place and not let ourselves be drawn into this emotional battle. So in some of those cases we just have to say, you know, like the child insists on wearing a shirt with mustard stain on it to school, and we say, you know, I'm not going to fight that battle. We have to pick our battles pretty carefully, and especially if there tends to be a little bit of a chronic irritation, then I encourage parents to say, now, hold it, is there anything I'm doing to feed this by what we sometimes call in psychology a hard startup? You know, I come to the child already angry or already demanding or already irritated. And so softening our own startup while at the same time trying to prepare ourselves with some reasonable limits and initiate positive conversations with our children. You know, one of the, maybe the elephant in the room too is that we need to also have been doing a lot of things over the years to build a positive relationship balance with our children, so that when we get to the teen years, we aren't running on the edge of overdraft every day.
Thank you. And ladies and gents, it's the top of the hour, and what I propose is that the official part of the webinar is over, and the good doc, if you could help answer just a few more questions. Anybody who would like to stay behind to listen to some of these responses, you're welcome to do so, but we will stop the recording of the webinar and just continue on just for a few more. Doc, can you help us with just a few more questions?
Be glad to do it, Binoy. You bet.